And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again, we have this slow-moving system continues to wash down the southeast coastal areas. And this system, slowly moving eastward, spreads rain or keeps it wet over all the interior areas. Maybe a little bit more showery over south central Alaska, a lot less showery over the Copper River Basin up into the eastern interior areas, dry for the North Slope and Arctic coast. And the next system out here to the west tracks eastward, the central Aleutians, tomorrow afternoon. A break along the southwest coast, showers start to taper off or possibly even end there. But this trough and that system keeps it wet, Kodiak Island, and some rain continues. North Gulf Coast, showers over the inland area, south central Alaska, isolated showers over the mountainous terrain of the Copper River Basin, dry from the eastern Alaska Range up to the eastern interior here, mid and upper Tanana Valley areas due to the south Chinook winds coming off the eastern Alaska Range. Wind advisories remains out through tomorrow for gusts to 60 miles an hour until midnight tomorrow night. And then this system kind of moves up and rotates around, and by Saturday afternoon is a trough. So a wet start to the weekend here over southern Alaska, up into the northwest interior, back to the west coast. Pretty good storm system developing that will hit the southeast coast Saturday night and Sunday, breakout over the western Aleutians. Next system, not all that strong, bringing some rain into the far western areas, Shimei and Attu, but drying out, Adak and Atka, eastern Aleutians, even the Pribilofs may see some clearing. And for the coastal water forecast for tomorrow, Friday, south coast, west-northwesterlies 20 knots, north coast, south to southeast 20 to 25 knots, and good small craft advisories on the north coast, east 25 to 30 knots with 8 to 10 foot seas up that way. Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots, south of 20 for Stevens Passage, and south 20 knots for Clarence Strait. For Saturday, north coast here, east winds 30 to 35 knots with seas up to 18 feet. In the central coast, southeast 25 knots, south coast, same thing, southwest 25 knots, 15 to 17 foot seas through there. And a lot windier now over the inside channels here with southeast winds 30 knots for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait, and southeast 30 gusts 45 knots for Lynn Canal. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories for Friday. East winds 25 knots, seas 4 feet. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast. Southeast winds 25 knots, east 30 knots, Barren Islands. Southeast 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. And for Southern Cook Inlet, southeast winds, or east winds 30 knots, east winds 20 knots north of Forelands. And then for Saturday, Cook Inlet, north winds 20 knots. Gale warnings, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, northwest 35 knots with seas 11 to 13 feet. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories continue. East winds at 25 knots with 6 foot seas. 30 to 35 knot winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast with seas 16 to 17 feet. Kodiak Island, northeast to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, west winds 15 to 20 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, west winds 15 knots. And then those increase significantly on Saturday. Bristol Bay, west winds at 30 knots with 9 foot seas. And for the Alaska Peninsula, west winds 25 to 30 knots. And Kodiak Island, west winds 30 knots, seas up to 10 feet. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, west winds 15 to 20 knots, Adak and Atka southwesterlies at 15 knots. And for the western Aleutians, kind of a squirrely variable wind pattern out here. Actually low pressure right in this area, so you got north to northwest 15 to 20 knots west of Kiska, southeast 30 knots from Chitka Island. And then for Saturday, western Aleutians, south to southwest winds 20 to 30 knots, south to southwest at 15 to 20 knots for Adak and Atka, and west-southwest 20 to 25 for the eastern Aleutians. Pretty light winds along the southwest coast, variable at 10 knots, east 10 for St. Lawrence Island, south 10 for Norton Sound, and variable at 10 for St. Matthew Island. Strongest winds, Pribilofs, but only at 15 knots out of the west. And for Saturday, southwest coast here, northwest winds 15 to 25 knots, seas 3 to 5 feet. Pribilof south or west at 20 knots, west 20 knots for St. Matthew Island, north to northeast at 10 to 15 knots there for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound. Central, eastern Beaufort Sea coast. East winds 15 knots for the day Friday with 4-foot seas. Western coast east at 20 knots and turning northeast there down toward Cape Lisburne. But then for the Chukchi Sea, variable winds 10 to 15 knots. And for Saturday, west to south winds 10 to 15 knots for the Chukchi Sea coast and east 15 knots for the central and western Arctic coast. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west winds 10 knots, seas down to 2 feet.